They promised you peace. They promised you strength. They promised deliverance from the very anxiety that gnawed at the American dream from within, like acid corrodes cold, indifferent steel. By 1978, at the very peak of its chthonic power, at the peak of its pharmaceutical tyranny, American doctors were prescribing 2.3 billion Valium pills annually. It was enough for every man, every woman, and every child in this country, from coast to coast, to receive their own personal measured dose of chemical calm, their small, bitter-tasting portion of oblivion. They were called Mother's Little Helper, a sedative for an entire generation, a soft chemical blanket, woven from promises and billion-dollar profits, sheltering from all the hardships of the post-war world. That was the official version. A beautiful, glossy lie, printed on the pages of medical journals smelling of expensive coated paper, printer's ink, and an impenetrable, almost divine smugness. The truth was far more terrifying. The truth smelled of hospital antiseptic, the stale air of bedrooms where people hadn't slept for weeks, listening to the hum of their own blood and the metallic taste of despair on the tongue. The truth was in the millions of souls caught in the flawless, elegant trap of physical dependence, created by a medicine prescribed with a paternal smile by their own family doctor. The truth is a deafening, invisible neurological storm known as withdrawal syndrome. A storm so excruciating that many preferred to remain in lifelong chemical slavery, just to never again go through that personal, soul-searing hell. You were told it was for your health, but in reality, it was for their profit. This is not just a story about a pill. It is the story of how one single elegant molecule seduced, conquered, and nearly destroyed the soul of an entire nation. But to understand how this perfect monster was created, we must return to the ashes of the Second World War, to an era when the greatest victory in human history gave birth to the deepest, most corrosive anxiety. In the sterile white laboratories of post-war America, where men in starched lab coats smelling of bleach and tobacco pursued molecules with the zeal of medieval alchemists searching for the philosopher's stone, a quiet, invisible revolution was brewing. The year was 1955, and the nation was struggling with a strange, exhausting paradox. It had won the greatest war in history, achieved unprecedented prosperity, built cities glittering with chrome and glass, whose spires scratched the heavens. And yet its people could not sleep. They could not relax. Their hands trembled as they raised their morning coffee cups to their lips, and their thoughts raced like crazed horses in a burning barn. The American century had arrived, and it was making everyone deeply, desperately anxious. The war had ended 10 years ago, but its ghosts still lingered in the air, thick with the smell of Chesterfield cigarette smoke, cheap whiskey, and unspoken clammy fear. Men who had gone through the hell of battles in Europe and the Pacific returned home changed, with empty, scorched eyes, haunted by memories they could not speak of. At night, in the silence of suburban bedrooms, they heard the phantom whistle of falling bombs and the death cries of comrades long turned to dust on foreign soil. They woke up in a cold sweat, a silent scream stuck in their throats, frightening their wives and children. They flinched at loud noises, the backfire of a passing car, a book falling to the floor, that sent them back to the trenches of Normandy or the beaches of Iwo Jima. They couldn't hold down a job or maintain relationships, pushing away those who loved them with an invisible wall of terror and alienation. The First World War's term shell shock had given way to the softer, more streamlined combat fatigue. But the essence remained the same: a deep, festering psychological wound that no doctor knew how to treat. And it wasn't just the veterans. Their wives, who had single-handedly kept families afloat during years of uncertainty, who had built Liberator bombers and waited for letters from the front scribbled in pencil on thin paper, found that peace brought its own suffocating anxieties. The pressure to create perfect homes, raise perfect children, and maintain a perfect appearance like the movie stars on magazine covers was crushing. The suburbs, with their identical houses and immaculate lawns, were supposed to be a paradise on earth, the embodiment of the American dream. But for many women, they turned into elegant prisons of isolation and unfulfilled expectations, smelling of floor wax and window cleaner. The air smelled of freshly mown grass, front yard roses, and a quiet, silent, all-pervading despair. The corporate world, the engine of American prosperity, demanded absolute conformity. The gray flannel suit became the uniform of American business, and beneath these scratchy, identical suits beat hearts racing with anxiety and amphetamines. One had to climb the career ladder, elbowing colleagues out of the way. Quotas had to be met at any cost. The boss had to be pleased. Competition was fierce, and failure was not an option. It smelled of shame and dismissal. Men developed stomach ulcers, which they soothed with milk and antacids. They smoked one cigarette after another, filling offices with a hazy, suffocating smoke. They drank heavily after work in dimly lit bars, trying to wash away the day's tension and silence the voice of fear, and they couldn't sleep. The pharmaceutical industry understood this. It had already given the world barbiturates, phenobarbital, secobarbital. These heavy chemical sledgehammers could knock a person out, plunging them into oblivion, but could just as easily kill. The line between a therapeutic dose and a lethal one was terrifyingly, unforgivably thin. An accidental overdose in search of sleep, a deliberate one in a fit of despair, there was little difference. Barbiturates made no distinctions. Judy Garland, Marilyn Monroe, and countless lesser-known but no less miserable people found their final rest in the cold embrace of these ruthless compounds. Morgues across the country smelled of their chemical aftertaste. The medical community knew they needed something better, something safer, something that could calm the frayed modern nervous system without stopping the heart. They needed a controlled storm, not a nuclear explosion in the brain. They needed a sniper's shot, not carpet bombing. No one yet suspected that the answer would be found by chance, in a dusty flask forgotten on a laboratory shelf in New Jersey, and that this discovery, born of failure and disarray, would bring relief to millions, but ultimately sow the seeds of an even more terrible and insidious epidemic. At the pharmaceutical company Hoffman La Roche, in its American branch in Nutley, New Jersey, a Polish chemist named Leo Sternbach was given an assignment that would change the world. He, a refugee from the Nazi regime, a man who had personally fled from terror, hiding in forests and basements, a man who knew fear firsthand, was tasked with finding a new tranquilizer, something that could compete with the blockbuster sedatives, like Milltown, that other companies were developing, bringing them millions. Sternbach, methodical and endlessly patient, began working with a class of compounds called benzoxadiazines. For 2 years, from 1955 to 1957, he synthesized molecule after molecule 40 times in a row. His laboratory was his universe, filled with the smell of chemical reagents, ozone from the running equipment, and a quiet, persistent disappointment. He tested them on laboratory mice, searching for that elusive, almost mythical combination of efficacy and safety. He found nothing. 40 attempts, 40 failures. The mice either remained just as anxious, or fell too deeply asleep, or died. The project was deemed a failure. In 1957, frustrated and under pressure from his superiors to move on to more promising research, Sternbach and his colleague Earl Reeder began a general cleanup of the laboratory. They needed to make space for new, more promising projects. There, on a distant shelf, covered in a thick layer of dust like a shroud, stood several crystalline compounds they had synthesized, but never tested. One of them was labeled Rho 5-Rho692. On a whim, perhaps out of a scientific meticulousness ingrained in his very being, or simple human curiosity, they decided to conduct one final test, just to check a box, to achieve closure. The glass flask was cold to the touch, its crystalline contents gleaming dimly under the harsh light of the fluorescent lamps. They dissolved the powder and administered it to a group of restless, neurotic mice. The results were extraordinary. Not just good, unbelievable. In animal studies, the compound induced deep muscle relaxation and sedation without the slightest respiratory depression that made barbiturates so deadly. The mice that received the drug became calm, almost philosophically serene. Their tense, cramped muscles relaxed, but they remained conscious and alert. They did not turn into chemical zombies. The margin of safety was enormous. An animal could be given a dose many times higher than the therapeutic one, and it would simply fall peacefully asleep, then wake up as if nothing had happened. They had found the holy grail of psychopharmacology. They had stumbled upon something unprecedented. Further analysis revealed something even more astonishing. It turned out that the compound was not a benzoxadiazine at all, as they had thought. During the chemical synthesis reaction, the molecule had spontaneously rearranged itself into a completely different, previously unknown structure. A 7-membered ring fused to a 6-membered one, with nitrogen atoms in strategically important places. They had accidentally, by mistake, created the world's first benzodiazepine. The greatest discovery was the result of sloppiness. The management of Hoffmann-La Roche, smelling big money, immediately recognized the potential. The development of the compound was fast-tracked with unprecedented speed. They named it chlordiazepoxide. The marketing department, realizing that no doctor would be able to either pronounce or remember such a cumbersome name, gave it a trade name that would become synonymous with mid-century anxiety relief: Librium. When Librium hit the market in 1960, it was an instant sensation. Here it was, a pill that could calm nerves, relax tense muscles, and help people sleep, all without the lethal danger of barbiturates. Doctors, who had lived in constant fear of prescribing sedatives after so many tragic overdoses, now had something they could hand out with complete confidence. The safety profile seemed revolutionary. A patient could take a handful of pills, a dose 10 times the recommended amount, and wake up with only a slight hangover. But Leo Sternbach was not finished. He was a perfectionist. Working in his laboratory, he began to tinker with the chlordiazepoxide molecule, making small, precise changes to see if he could improve on perfection. In 1963, his team synthesized a new compound. It was more potent, faster acting, and had an even cleaner effect than Librium, the chemical name diazepam. The Hoffmann-La Roche marketing team outdid themselves this time. They named it Valium, from the Latin word valere, meaning to be strong or to be healthy. The choice was genius. It suggested not weakness or dependence, but restoration, strength, and balance. It was not a medicine for the sick, but a tool for the strong. It was not a crutch, but rocket fuel for climbing the social ladder. Valium was approved by the FDA in 1963, and what followed was arguably the most successful pharmaceutical launch in history. Within 2 years, it had surpassed Librium to become the most prescribed drug in America. By 1969, it had become the most prescribed drug in the entire world. At the peak of its power, in 1978, doctors were writing prescriptions for a staggering 2.3 billion Valium tablets annually in the United States alone. The little yellow pills, the blue ones, the white ones, each dosage conveniently color-coded, became the chemical wallpaper of American life. Valium was not a street drug. It wasn't some exotic substance from a faraway land. It was medicine. It was from a doctor. It was prescribed. It was safe. It was normal. And for a brief, chemically mediated moment in the 1960s and 70s, an entire generation came to believe that anxiety, stress, and the general friction of daily existence were not things to be endured, but conditions to be treated. Pharmaceutically, constantly. With a small, neat pill that you took 2 or 3 times a day. Every day. For the rest of your life. The revolution began, promising peace and tranquility. But its true destructive consequences, like a slow poison, would only become clear decades later. The transformation of the American household in the post-war era was profound and deeply contradictory. Women who had worked in factories during the war, building bombers and welding ship hulls, feeling their own power and significance, were politely but firmly told to return to the kitchen. The suburban dream, this new Eden, was being built acre by acre on the outskirts of every major city. 2-story houses with 2-car garages, manicured lawns smelling of freshness, and the promise of quiet, serene domestic bliss. But something in this paradise was fundamentally wrong. The housewife, that idealized image from advertisements, in a starched dress and pearls, was suffocating. The endless, monotonous repetition of domestic chores, the isolation of the suburbs where houses stood close but neighbors were strangers, the loss of identity tied to defining oneself solely through one's husband and children. All of this created a special kind of torment, a quiet, invisible, shameful one. The writer Betty Friedan would later call it the problem that has no name. However, the medical establishment had a name for it: anxiety. And they had a solution. Women would go to their family doctors, complaining of nervousness, of migraines, of tension headaches, of an inexplicable inability to cope with the daily demands of running a household. They described feeling as if they were trapped, exhausted by the monotony of it all, as if the walls of their perfect home were slowly closing in. And their doctors, almost exclusively men, were trained to see these complaints through a very specific, simplistic lens. These were not social problems or existential questions. They were medical symptoms, and medical symptoms required medical treatment. Out came the prescription pad, and a pen, with a faint scratch, would write the magic word on it. First Librium, then Valium. The little pills became as integral a part of the suburban housewife's routine as morning coffee and daytime soap operas. Take one in the morning to get through the chaos of breakfast and driving the kids to school. Take another at noon, when the loneliness became almost palpable, thick as fog. Maybe a third before dinner, to smooth the day's rough edges and make the evening with a tired, silent husband bearable. Pharmaceutical companies targeted their marketing directly at this demographic, though not through television commercials for consumers. That would be permitted much later. Instead, they bombarded doctors with advertisements in medical journals and through an army of charming pharmaceutical sales representatives. The ads were strikingly frank in their sexist assumptions. They depicted exhausted housewives, women overwhelmed by children and domestic duties, women who were tense, irritable, difficult. The subtext was clear. These women were problems to be managed, and Valium was the perfect management tool. One Hoffman La Roche ad from that era showed a woman surrounded by screaming children, her face a mask of stress. The caption read, "Alone and psycho-neurotic." The message was consistent. Any deviation from a perfect doll-like placidity, any manifestation of normal human stress or dissatisfaction, was a medical condition requiring pharmaceutical intervention. And women took the pills, not because they were weak or foolish, but because they were suffering, and it was the only help offered to them. No one discussed whether the demands placed on them were reasonable. No one suggested that the problem might be structural, rather than personal. No one acknowledged that the feeling of suffocation in a life constrained by other people's expectations could be a perfectly rational response, not a symptom of illness. The pills worked, at least at first. Valium had a remarkable ability to smooth over anxiety, to take the sharp edges off reality and make the unbearable merely tiresome. That constant knot of tension in the chest would loosen. Racing thoughts would slow. The world became softer, more manageable, a little more distant, as if behind frosted glass. But tolerance developed. The body, that brilliant mechanism of adaptation, grew accustomed to the constant presence of the drug. And what once required one pill now required two. Two became three. Three became a standing prescription, renewed monthly without many questions, because doctors were insistently told that these drugs were safe and non-addictive. After all, they weren't the deadly barbiturates. The Rolling Stones perfectly captured this era in their 1966 song, Mother's Little Helper, a scathing commentary on pharmaceutical motherhood. The lyrics spoke of a mother who needed something to help her get through her stressful day, to chase the clouds away. The song became an anthem, though it was never clear whether the women singing along were celebrating their chemical crutch or mourning it. By the early 1970s, Valium consumption in the United States had reached the scale of a quiet epidemic. One study showed that 15 to 20% of American women had used a benzodiazepine in the past year. These were not street junkies shooting up in grimy back alleys. These were mothers, teachers, secretaries, nurses, respectable women with respectable prescriptions from respectable doctors. They didn't know that the pills they trusted so much were slowly, imperceptibly, and irreversibly changing their brain chemistry in ways that would make stopping them nearly impossible. They didn't know that the salvation they held in their hands was actually a cage. While housewives were being prescribed Valium for existential dread, the psychiatric community was undergoing its own, much louder revolution, and benzodiazepines were at its epicenter. The 1960s and 70s were a turning point in the treatment of mental illness, and these new, clean drugs played a key, defining role. Before benzodiazepines, psychiatry's toolkit was limited and often inhumanly cruel. Severe mental illnesses were treated with insulin coma therapy, which artificially induced comas, risking the patient's life. Electroconvulsive therapy, which passed a powerful electric current through the brain to induce seizures, often leading to memory loss. And of course, prefrontal lobotomy, a barbaric procedure that involved severing nerve connections in the brain's prefrontal cortex with an instrument resembling an ice pick. These were not subtle interventions. They were desperate, barbaric measures for desperate situations, and they often left patients in a worse, vegetative state than before. For milder conditions, for the anxiety disorders and neuroses that filled outpatient psychiatric clinics, the options were talk therapy or barbiturates. Talk therapy was expensive, time-consuming, and of questionable efficacy. Barbiturates were dangerous, potentially lethal, and turned patients into listless zombies. Benzodiazepines changed everything. A drug appeared that worked quickly, was surprisingly safe in overdose, and could be prescribed by any doctor, not just a psychiatrist. It democratized psychiatric care in a way that had never been possible before. The general practitioner could now treat anxiety disorders with the same confidence with which they treated high blood pressure or a sore throat. The drugs were truly, undeniably effective. In controlled trials, benzodiazepines consistently outperformed placebo in reducing symptoms of anxiety. Patients reported feeling better, sleeping better, functioning better. For people suffering from panic attacks, where the heart hammers like a trapped bird, breathing becomes impossible, and an icy, all-consuming certainty of imminent death grips the chest, benzodiazepines could stop an attack in its tracks. For those with generalized anxiety disorder, where every moment is filled with a vague yet overwhelming dread, the drugs brought a relief that no amount of talk therapy seemed to be able to provide. Emergency rooms began using benzodiazepines for alcohol withdrawal, a condition that can be fatal. The drugs prevented seizures, reduced tremors, and made the agonizing process of detoxification bearable. Anesthesiologists used them before surgery to calm patients and induce amnesia, so that the terrifying experience of the trip to the operating room, the smell of antiseptic, and the glint of steel would not be remembered. Neurologists discovered that certain benzodiazepines, particularly clonazepam and diazepam, were potent anticonvulsants. They became indispensable emergency drugs, the first line of defense against status epilepticus. By the mid-1970s, benzodiazepines were being prescribed for everything. The indications expanded with each passing year. Anxiety, insomnia, muscle spasms, seizures, alcohol withdrawal, pre-surgical premedication, irritable bowel syndrome, tension headaches, the stress of caring for a sick relative, the pressure of final exams. If a patient complained of any form of psychological or even physical discomfort, a prescription for a benzodiazepine was often the first, automatic response. The medical literature was overwhelmingly enthusiastic. Thousands of articles documented the drug's efficacy. Side effects seemed minimal. Some drowsiness, perhaps difficulty with coordination. This was considered an entirely acceptable trade-off for the relief the drugs provided. The package inserts mentioned the theoretical possibility of dependence, but this was presented as an extremely rare occurrence, happening only with huge doses or in patients with an addictive personality. Doctors were told, and they genuinely believed, that they were witnessing a therapeutic revolution. The mental suffering that had plagued humanity since the beginning of time could now be treated effectively and safely with a simple pill. It seemed almost miraculous. But beneath this shining triumph, deep, dark cracks were beginning to appear. Some patients who tried to stop taking benzodiazepines after months or years of use found they could not. They experienced symptoms that were written off as a return of their original anxiety. No one yet understood that the symptoms were not a return, but a creation, withdrawal from the drug itself. The brain, having adapted to the constant presence of the drug, now depended on it for normal functioning. The warning signs were drowned out by a deafening chorus of success and billion-dollar profits. Benzodiazepines had become too integral to modern medicine, too convenient for doctors to be seriously questioned. They were everywhere. The therapeutic revolution continued its triumphant march, unaware that it was building its magnificent palace on a foundation of sand. While Valium ruled the respectable world of prescription pads and pharmacy counters, a parallel, sinister story was unfolding in the dark, criminal shadows. Benzodiazepines, for all their medical legitimacy, were also becoming a valuable commodity on the black market. These were mind-altering pills, and wherever such substances exist, there will be people who want them for reasons their doctors would never approve of. The diversion began in small, obvious ways. People with legitimate prescriptions realized they could sell their pills. A month's prescription for 60 Valium tablets could be worth significant money to the right buyer. Pharmacies, especially in poor neighborhoods, became targets of brazen break-ins. The thieves knew exactly what they were looking for: the benzodiazepine shelf. But the real criminal innovation came from a completely different direction. In the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s, organized crime discovered benzodiazepines, particularly Rohypnol, a drug that was never approved in the US, but was widely available in Europe and Latin America. Rohypnol, known by its generic name flunitrazepam, was a monstrously potent benzodiazepine, about 10 times stronger than Valium. In therapeutic doses, it was used for severe insomnia, but it had properties that made it especially attractive to criminals. It acted with lightning speed, inducing sedation within 15-20 minutes. It caused profound anterograde amnesia, meaning the victim often could not recall events that occurred under its influence. And crucially, it was tasteless and odorless, dissolving completely in any drink without a trace. The drug began to appear in nightclubs and bars, not by prescription, but bought on the street or smuggled in. It was used as a weapon, slipped into drinks. It rendered the victim completely pliable, unable to resist, and later unable to testify. The term date rape drug entered the cultural lexicon, and Rohypnol became its horrifying symbol. But benzodiazepines found another criminal use, more prosaic, but far more widespread. They became the perfect complement to other drugs. Heroin addicts discovered that adding a benzodiazepine to their ritual enhanced the euphoria, deepening the nod. The combination was synergistic and exceptionally dangerous, as both drugs suppressed respiration. The number of overdose deaths involving the combination of opioids and benzodiazepines began to rise steadily. Cocaine users discovered that benzodiazepines could smooth out the harsh come-down, easing the severity of the paranoia and agitation that followed a cocaine binge. Methamphetamine users took them to force themselves to sleep after several days of chemically induced wakefulness. For polydrug users, benzodiazepines became indispensable tools in managing the chaos of their own self-destruction. Prescription fraud evolved into a veritable art form. Sophisticated criminals stole prescription pads, forged signatures, or created entire fictitious medical practices. Doctor shopping became commonplace. Some doctors, driven by greed, turned their offices into pill mills, writing thousands of prescriptions for benzodiazepines for cash, without any medical basis. By the early 2000s, benzodiazepines had become a significant component of the prescription drug abuse epidemic that swept the United States. They were the cause of thousands of emergency room visits annually. They contributed to the rising tide of overdose deaths. And yet, they remained widely prescribed, widely available, and widely used. The pills that promised safety and legitimacy found their way into the darkest corners of society, used as weapons, as commodities, as tools of self-destruction. The first cracks in the benzodiazepine consensus appeared in the late 1970s, and they came not from medical researchers, but from the patients themselves. Mostly women began to speak out about their experiences of trying to stop taking the drugs they had been prescribed for years. They described something that did not align with the official medical narrative. When they tried to stop taking Valium or Librium, even by slowly tapering the dose as their doctors advised, they experienced symptoms that were far worse than the anxiety that had led to the prescription. Severe insomnia that lasted for weeks. Panic attacks of an intensity they had never experienced. Muscle twitches and uncontrollable tremors. Painful hypersensitivity to light and sound. A sense of unreality, derealization, as if the world had become strange, alien, and threatening. Their doctors, for the most part, did not believe them. Their suffering was invalidated. The symptoms were written off as a return of the original anxiety disorder, which only proved that the patient still needed the medication. Some women were told the problem was purely psychological, that they were simply afraid to give up the security blanket of the pills. They were shamed and accused of weakness. But the women persisted. They began to find each other, creating underground support groups where they could share their experiences without judgment or disbelief. They read the medical literature and discovered that their symptoms matched exactly the clinical description of benzodiazepine withdrawal. A syndrome that was recognized in the scientific literature, but consistently downplayed in communications with patients and practitioners. The evidence became impossible to ignore. In 1980, the prestigious British medical journal published a landmark, explosive article by Dr. Malcolm Lader, a psychopharmacologist from the Institute of Psychiatry in London. The article was titled, "Benzodiazepines, Opiate of the Masses," and it pulled no punches. Lader argued that benzodiazepines, especially with long-term use, caused widespread, massive addiction. He fiercely criticized the marketing practices of the pharmaceutical industry and challenged the complacency of the medical community. The article caused a sensation. In the United Kingdom, the reaction was swift and dramatic. The Committee on Safety of Medicines issued new, strict guidelines in 1988, recommending that benzodiazepines be prescribed only for the short-term relief, 2 to 4 weeks, of severe anxiety or insomnia. Doctors were warned about the risks of dependence. The pharmaceutical companies resisted fiercely. Hoffmann La Roche, in particular, faced a public relations nightmare. Valium, their flagship product, was now portrayed as dangerous and addictive. Lawsuits began to pile up. In the UK, thousands of patients filed a class action lawsuit. In 1994, after many years of litigation, the case was settled. The patients received nothing. The judge ruled that while dependence was a real risk, it had been stated in the fine print of the instructions. It was a hollow, cynical victory for the pharmaceutical industry. The damage to the reputation of benzodiazepines was done. By the early 2000s, the medical consensus had shifted. Benzodiazepines were no longer seen as a miracle cure. Official guidelines now clearly stated, use only for the short term at the lowest possible dose. But this left a huge problem unresolved. What about the millions of people who had already been taking these drugs for years, or even decades? For them, the damage was already done. They faced a terrible choice: continue taking a drug now acknowledged as harmful, or go through the agonizing and prolonged process of withdrawal. And just as the medical community was beginning to warily acknowledge the problems with the older benzodiazepines, the pharmaceutical industry launched a new, even more aggressive campaign that would create a whole new generation of addicts. The drug was called alprazolam, marketed under the brand name Xanax, and it would become the defining anxiety medication of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Xanax was not new. It had been approved by the FDA in 1981 specifically for the treatment of panic disorder. But in the late 1990s and 2000s, its use exploded. Unlike Valium, which was associated with the repressed housewives of the 1970s, Xanax was marketed as a modern, high-tech solution for modern anxiety. It was fast-acting, potent, and effective. It came in convenient dosages, including the infamous 2-milligram bars, Xanax bars, which became a cultural icon. The timing was perfect. America in the late 1990s and 2000s was experiencing a new wave of anxiety. The fears of terrorism after 9/11, the economic stress of the 2008 financial crisis, and the constant psychological pressure of the nascent social media age. Xanax was positioned as the perfect solution. It was seen as a sophisticated, selective, precisely targeted drug. But its short half-life was a double-edged sword. The drug left the system quickly, which meant that the relief was fleeting. Patients found themselves taking it multiple times a day. The rapid onset and offset created a vicious cycle, particularly conducive to powerful psychological dependence. The brain learned to associate the drug with relief, and the craving to take it became overwhelming. The drug culture of the 2000s and 2010s embraced Xanax in a way that Valium never was. It became referenced in hip-hop lyrics, casually mentioned in social media posts, normalized as a common coping mechanism for the stresses of modern life. Taking Xanax was no longer something to be ashamed of. Memes proliferated. Xanax and chill. The drug became part of the cultural lexicon of a generation that was more anxious, more medicated, and more open about it than any before. What happened next was predictable. A new wave of addiction and withdrawal emerged, this time among younger patients. Xanax withdrawal, due to its short half-life and high potency, was often even worse than withdrawal from older benzodiazepines. The symptoms came on fast and were excruciatingly intense. In the 2010s, the story grew even darker. Xanax became intertwined with another epidemic, the opioid crisis. The combination of benzodiazepines and opioids was particularly deadly. Both drugs suppressed respiration, and together they created a synergistic effect that could stop it entirely. Overdose deaths involving benzodiazepines, almost always in combination with opioids, skyrocketed. In 2019, benzodiazepines were involved in more than 9,000 overdose deaths in the United States. The pills that had promised safety and relief had become a significant driver of one of the deadliest drug epidemics in American history. The Xanax generation found itself in the same trap as their grandmother's generation decades earlier. They were prescribed a drug that worked brilliantly in the short term, but in the long term, created problems that were far worse than the original symptoms. And the medical system that had created the problem seemed utterly ill-equipped to solve it. To understand how benzodiazepines went from a wonder drug to a medical disaster, we have to travel into the microscopic architecture of the brain, into the world of neurotransmitters and receptors, where invisible chemical messages determine our every thought, every feeling, every breath. The human brain is an electrochemical machine of staggering complexity. Its 100 billion neurons communicate using chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. The balance between excitation and inhibition is what allows the brain to function. The primary inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain is gamma-aminobutyric acid, or GABA. When GABA binds to its receptors, it makes neurons less likely to fire. It quiets down neural activity. In a sense, GABA is the brain's natural tranquilizer, the chemical brake that prevents runaway excitation and keeps the system stable. When a benzodiazepine molecule binds to its special site on the GABA receptor, it doesn't activate the receptor directly. Instead, it makes the receptor more sensitive to GABA. It's a positive allosteric modulator, a molecule that enhances the effect of the natural neurotransmitter. This is why benzodiazepines work so well. They don't hack the system. They just turn up the volume dial on the brain's natural calming system. But the brain is not passive. It is constantly adapting. When benzodiazepines enhance GABA signaling day after day, week after week, the brain notices that it is overly inhibited and starts to compensate. The number of GABA receptors on the neurons decreases, a process called down-regulation. The remaining receptors become less sensitive. This is tolerance. This new equilibrium is fragile. The brain has adapted to functioning with the drug. Suddenly remove the drug, and the system is thrown into chaos. There are too few GABA receptors, and they are too insensitive. The excitatory systems, ramped up to compensate, now run unopposed. The result is a state of extreme hyperexcitability. Neurons fire too easily, too often. The brain is flooded with excitatory signals that cannot be controlled. This is withdrawal. The symptoms reflect this underlying neurological storm. Anxiety, far worse than the original. Insomnia. Seizures in the most severe cases. The recovery process is slow because the brain's adaptations must be reversed. This neuroplastic remodeling takes time, a minimum of months, sometimes years. The bitter irony is that the very mechanism that makes benzodiazepines effective, their ability to enhance the brain's natural calming system, also makes them dangerous. By boosting GABA signaling, they trigger adaptations that make the brain dependent on their continued presence. The wonder drug becomes a prison. The cure becomes the disease. We arrive at the present day, at a moment of reckoning. The story of benzodiazepines, which began with such hope in the sterile labs of the 1950s, has taken us through triumph, excess, addiction, and tragedy. The question that confronts us now is, What do we do with this difficult legacy? Millions of people currently take benzodiazepines. Some have been taking them for decades. Others are new users, prescribed the drugs despite all the warnings. All of them face a difficult choice. For those who want to stop, the path is arduous. Benzodiazepine withdrawal must be conducted agonizingly, slowly, and carefully, following the Ashton method, a gradual taper over months or even years. But even with a careful taper, withdrawal can be brutal. The symptoms can be so severe that many people cannot complete the process. They reach a point where the suffering is unbearable and reinstate the medication. The medical system often provides inadequate support. The story of benzodiazepines forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about modern medicine and modern life. It shows how easily a drug can go from a miracle to a menace, how market forces can shape medical practice in ways that harm patients, how the promise of a chemical solution can seduce both doctors and patients into ignoring all the warning signs. It also reveals something deeper about our relationship with discomfort. The post-war era that gave us benzodiazepines was an era that increasingly saw any form of psychological or physical discomfort as a problem to be solved immediately, rather than an experience to be lived through. The danger of benzodiazepines was not just in their chemical effect on the brain, but in the message they carried: that you should never have to feel anxiety, that discomfort is abnormal, that for every problem, there is a pill. This message was absorbed by several generations. The decline of the pharmaceutical empire comes slowly. There are no dramatic collapses, no sudden exposés, no single moment when the world collectively realizes its mistake. Instead, there is a gradual, quiet fading, an admission that the miracle was not as miraculous as once believed. Benzodiazepines were not banned. They were not recalled from the market. They remain on pharmacy shelves, in medicine cabinets, in the pockets and purses of millions. But their unchallenged reign is over. The cultural moment when Valium was the symbol of an era has passed. What remains is a more sober and bitter assessment. These are powerful drugs with legitimate uses and very serious risks. They should be prescribed cautiously, used sparingly, and discontinued when possible. This is what all modern guidelines say. But understanding does not undo the past. The people who became dependent on these drugs in an era of careless prescribing still exist. And there are casualties, those who did not survive. Overdoses almost always in combination with other drugs. Suicides that occurred in the dark depths of withdrawal, when brain chemistry was so disrupted that death seemed the only way out. Lives lived in a fog of cognitive impairment, missed opportunities, ruined relationships. The lesson, if there is one, is a lesson of balance and humility. Balance between benefits and risks. Humility before what medicine can and cannot do, before the limits of our understanding, before the unintended consequences of our best intentions. The little yellow pills, the blue ones, the white ones, they sit in vials on shelves, chemical compounds waiting for their moment. They are neither good nor evil. They are tools, and like any powerful tool, they can help or harm depending on how they are used. The era when they were used carelessly, prescribed generously, consumed without question, that era, one hopes, is ending. What comes next is unclear, but it must be better. It must be wiser. We owe it to those who suffered, who became dependent, who fought to reclaim their lives from the grip of these deceptively simple molecules. The powder that promised tranquility, that ruled an era, that corrupted medical practice and damaged countless lives, is finally being put in its place. Not banned, not forgotten, but understood. Understood for what it truly is. A powerful medicine that can bring relief, but demands immense respect, which offers benefits, but exacts a terrible price. And that price is one we are still paying. The story is not over. It will not end as long as these drugs exist, as long as people suffer from anxiety and insomnia, as long as medicine seeks chemical solutions to human problems. But perhaps we can learn from what came before. Perhaps we can do better. Perhaps.